Tonight, I'm going to share with you a Japanese ghost story. This time, I'll be telling it in first person. I always thought I was the kind of person who didn't get scared easily. Since I was young, I've heard countless ghost stories and read many urban legends. Most of the time, I just treated them as jokes or late-night talk. But a few years ago, when I went to Japan to study, something I went through with my own eyes completely changed the way I see the supernatural. Before I went to Japan, I had already heard people say that it's a place filled with ghost stories and strange legends. Back in Taiwan, when I studied in the Japanese department, our teacher often told us that Japanese people's imagination about spirits and ghosts was much more detailed and real than what we usually thought. He even said that if you live in Japan long enough, sooner or later, you might run into something you cannot explain. There was one legend that I heard back then. At first, I laughed when I heard it, thinking it was just another exaggerated story. But later, I found out it connected in a terrifying way to something that I went through myself. That legend was called the Woman in the Gaps. The so-called Woman in the Gaps is very different from the kind of ghosts people usually imagine. She doesn't appear as a long-haired spirit standing under a streetlight, and she isn't a faceless shadow floating down the hallway at midnight. Instead, she hides in narrow spaces, small cracks and gaps that people normally ignore. People say she can stay in the space between a closet and the wall, or behind a door that is only slightly open. Most of the time, you don't notice anything at all. But if you happen to look into that gap by accident, you might suddenly see a pair of eyes staring straight back at you. In Japan, there was once a college student who had this terrifying experience. For several nights, he kept hearing strange noises in his room. At first, he thought it was just the wind and didn't care much about it. But one night, when he looked toward the narrow space between his bookshelf and the wall, he saw a pale face pressed tightly against the wall, completely still. The worst part was that the face slowly changed from blank and expressionless to a twisted, eerie smile. The student was so terrified that he ran out of his room immediately and didn't come back until morning. The next day, he gathered enough courage to check that gap again, but there was nothing inside. From that day on, he couldn't sleep. He always felt that something was hiding in the corners of his room, staring at him whenever the lights went out. Later, when he stopped going to classes for a long time, his professor reported it to his family. They went to his apartment to check, and what they found was horrifying. The young man's body was wedged tightly into the narrow space between the bookshelf and the wall. His eyes were wide open, and a strange smile was frozen on his face. After that incident spread, people finally believed that the Woman in the Gaps was more than just a story. When I first heard the story of the Woman in the Gaps, I was still a student. I thought it was nothing more than an urban legend. I listened, laughed a little, and forgot about it. But later, when I went to Japan to study, I realized some things are not jokes at all. I went to Japan in 2008. At the beginning, I stayed at a friend's house and lived there for about a year. My friend was really kind, but after such a long time, I felt embarrassed to keep bothering him. Around that time, my cousin and my cousin's younger sister asked me if I wanted to move in and live together with them. I had visited their place before, and for a student like me, their apartment was almost too good to be true. It had 3 bedrooms, a living room, and even a south-facing balcony. My room faced north, and right under the window there was a river, with rows of cherry blossom trees on both sides. When I moved in, it was April, and the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. Petals floated gently with the wind, and the scenery outside looked just like a painting. At that moment, I thought to myself, living here was pure happiness. For the first few months, life was peaceful and enjoyable. The 3 of us often cooked together, ate together, and stayed up chatting. The atmosphere felt warm and safe. But one weekend, when we casually started talking about ghost stories, everything began to change. One day, the 3 of us were sitting in the living room, chatting about random things. Somehow, the topic turned to ghost stories. I casually mentioned a strange experience my grandmother once told me. When she was young, she lived in an old wooden house in the countryside. The house had been there for decades, and the wooden floor creaked whenever you stepped on it. One hot summer night, she couldn't sleep, so she lay on her bed, listening to the cicadas outside. Suddenly, everything went silent. The buzzing of the cicadas stopped, and even the wind disappeared. She felt uneasy and looked toward the window. The old-style windows were made of frosted glass, and under the moonlight, she could vaguely see the shape of a person standing outside. My grandmother thought, who would be wandering around so late at night? She moved slightly, and to her horror, the shadow outside moved as well, slowly leaning closer to the window. She froze, too scared to even breathe, staring at it without making a sound. Eventually, the shadow pressed right up against the glass. Peeking through the gap, she realized it wasn't a human. It was a completely black figure with no face, only two round, pale white eyes. Even worse, the thing started clawing at the window frame, scratching again and again, making a harsh creaking sound, as if it was trying to force its way inside. My grandmother was so terrified that her whole body stiffened. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She just stared at it for what felt like forever, until finally the thing stopped, turned around, and left. She let out a sigh of relief until she looked down. On the wooden floor next to her bed, a line of wet, dark footprints appeared, starting from the window and ending right beside her. After that night of ghost stories, the atmosphere in the house somehow felt different. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but soon something happened that made me realize it was real. One afternoon, I came home from work feeling exhausted. I lay down in my room to take a nap. In a half-dreaming state, I suddenly heard the doorknob rattling softly, as if someone was trying to open the door. At first, I thought maybe my cousin had come home early, but she always called out before opening my door. A few seconds later, the rattling grew louder and more violent. The doorknob was being shaken up and down wildly, like someone was desperately trying to force their way in. My heart sank. I wanted to get up, but my whole body was stiff and frozen. My eyes were open, and I could clearly see the door shaking, but my arms and legs wouldn't move, as if something was pinning me down. After about 3 long minutes, the sound stopped. The door became quiet again. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that maybe it was just an earthquake. After all, earthquakes are common in Japan. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If it had been an earthquake, why didn't my bed shake? Why didn't the ceiling creak? Just as I was trying to shake off the fear, another strange event began happening. In the kitchen, there was a strange little window. Its structure was unusual. It could only be opened inward, like lifting a lid. I often opened it after cooking to let the air out. But several times, when I went to take a nap after lunch, I woke up to find the window mysteriously closed. That window was heavy and stiff. You had to lift the latch hard before pushing it down to close it. There was no way the wind could have shut it on its own. At first, I suspected my cousins had closed it, but when I asked them, they said they had also experienced the same thing. They dismissed it as the wind. But to me, it was too quiet, too deliberate, like someone had carefully shut it without making a sound. Then one day, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, the window was wide open. I finished, turned back toward my room when suddenly, the window slammed shut with tremendous force. There was no wind at all. To close it, someone would have had to lift the latch and push it down, which meant it wasn't an accident. At that moment, the thought struck me, could something be listening to us? Could it be closing the window on purpose, just to show me it was there? My whole body broke out in goosebumps. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house immediately. That night, I couldn't focus at work, my mind replaying the sound of the window slamming again and again. When I got home later, the 3 of us sat down and talked seriously. In the end, we decided no one should open that window again. It sounded silly, but honestly, we didn't know what else to do. We thought that by never opening the kitchen window again, things might calm down. But soon I realized the truly frightening part hadn't even started yet. One night, I came home earlier than usual, around 10 o'clock. My younger cousin was still working at the cafe and wouldn't be home until 11. My older cousin was out with her classmates at karaoke. So that evening, I was alone in the apartment. I was so tired that I lay down on the sofa to watch TV, and before I knew it, I had dozed off. In the middle of my half-sleep, I suddenly heard footsteps, slow, heavy steps coming down the hallway, moving closer and closer. The feeling was terrifyingly clear, as if someone was standing right next to me. I wanted to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt unbearably heavy. All I could feel was an invisible pressure weighing down on my body, like something was pinning me to the couch. Then the scariest thing happened. I felt something cold and invisible wrap around me, almost like an embrace. In that instant, I snapped awake in shock. I sat there frozen, my mind blank, too scared to even turn on the light. I don't know how long I sat like that, but when I finally looked at the clock, it was already 6:30 in the evening. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed out of the apartment and stayed at a friend's place for the next 2 nights. But that still wasn't the worst. A few days later, I went back during the day to pick up some of my things. I thought it would be safer in broad daylight. The apartment was empty, just me inside. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and when I lifted my head to look at the mirror, my blood ran cold. In the reflection, right next to my shoulder, there was half a face leaning out. The skin was completely black, like it had been burned. The face had no nose, no mouth, only a pair of glaring, white eyes. And then it smiled. That burned face slowly twisted into a horrifying grin. I spun around instantly, but of course, nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the face was still in the reflection, still smiling. I couldn't take it. I ran straight out of the bathroom, straight out of the apartment, without even stopping to dry my hands. From that day on, I was completely sure this place was not normal. This wasn't just a creepy house. Something else was living here with us. After the mirror incident, I was completely broken inside. I made up my mind. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to move out. When I finally told my cousins about everything I had seen, they had been doubtful at first. But as time passed, they also started experiencing strange things themselves. Doors rattling in the middle of the night, unexplained noises, and even waking up unable to move, as if something was pressing down on them. Eventually, they admitted it too. The apartment wasn't clean. Something was definitely wrong with it. In the end, the 3 of us agreed we had no choice but to leave. It wasn't easy to find a new place, but anything was better than staying in that haunted apartment. None of us ever dared to spend another night there. After moving out, I returned to Taiwan, but the fear and confusion still followed me. I needed answers, so I went to talk to my old Japanese teacher and told him everything that had happened. He listened quietly, not interrupting me. When I finished, he sighed and finally said something that chilled me to the bone. That place probably had a Jibakurei. In Japanese belief, a Jibakurei is a bound spirit, a soul that died in a certain place but couldn't move on, usually because of deep resentment or unfinished business. Over time, the spirit becomes tied to the location itself, unable to leave. Anyone who lives there will eventually be affected by it. Hearing this, I felt my whole back go cold. So it wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't me scaring myself. Something had truly been there all along. Since then, I've never doubted the existence of the supernatural again. Japanese urban legends aren't just scary stories told for fun. Sometimes they are based on real events, and sometimes people even die because of them. That's the end of my story for tonight. If you think you're brave enough, you can laugh it off as just a tale. But if deep down you feel uneasy after hearing this, then remember what I'm about to say. Before you go to bed tonight, check the gaps in your room, the spaces in the walls, the cracks by the closet, or the door left slightly open. Because you never know if, in the dark, a pair of eyes might be silently staring back at you.